So today we're going to be talking about the early 90s, and specifically we're going to be talking about the console wars. So it's my pleasure to have two guest speakers with us. So we have Coury Carlson over here. And let me see if I can get their faces on the other screen so you guys can see them. There we go. So we got Coury Carlson from the YouTube channel My Life in Gaming. He does a lot of cool videos kind of showing how you can get this video signals out of your retro consoles. A lot of cool documentaries as well. And then our
Thank
other
you.
guest speaker is John Linneman. He's from the YouTube channel Digital Foundry. They also have a lot of kind of like nice articles online. I know you do either the Digital Foundry retro videos as well, but great
Yep,
videos
yep, yep.
about like technical performance. Um, yeah, thank you for joining us, you both. I really appreciate you guys making the time to be with us.
Of
Uh,
Yeah, course.
Thanks for having us.
It's our pleasure.
so today's goals. I'm going to talk about the rise of Sega. So folks might be familiar with Sega. They don't make consoles anymore, but they still are making games. Then I'm going to transition into the console wars of the 90s. And we're going to end by talking about how Sony kind of entered the video game console scene as a result of the console wars. So John and Coury are just going to jump in whenever they want. And if you folks have any questions for them, feel free as well. Yeah, just keep an open communication. Awesome.
Right.
So recommended reading for today. A lot of this is covered in Console Wars, not so much the early Sega stuff, but in general, just like everything going on between Sega and Nintendo. All of it is listed here. Really good audiobook as well. And then Replay has a section on it as well. Not a super long section, but it does talk about it. So definitely recommend Console Wars.
They're both
I
I would say they're very entertaining books, but it is also kind of one-sided, if you will, because there is a lot more on the Japanese side that isn't really communicated well, I think, especially in Console Wars. You know what I mean? So like it's a great jumping off point because it is a very exciting read, but then there's a lot more to investigate, and we'll talk about some of that today.
Oh,
yeah.
perfect.
I'd
Yeah,
also recommend any of the books by Ken Horowitz, who runs the website Sega 16,
Oh yeah,
and he has a number of books on Sega specifically about the Game Gear, the Sega's arcade games, the Genesis, just really well written stuff and well researched stuff.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually there's a couple like interviews that I have one interview that I'm quoting from Sega 16 later on here. So yeah, definitely not a comprehensive overview, but absolutely those are good tips.
Yep.
Awesome. So first, where did Sega come from? So Sega has a very long history, and with a lot of topics today, we'll see that a lot of it starts around World War II. So Sega actually originated way back in 1940. There was a company that was founded called Standard Games in Honolulu, Hawaii. And these are the two of the three founders of Standard Games, Martin Bromley and Irving Bromberg. And basically, their goal was to be able to provide some slot machines for military bases during World War II. So the U.S. is ramping up in the Pacific, and there was a lot of soldiers on those bases, so they wanted to be able to like have coin-operated slot machines. And here's kind of an example of what one of those slot machines would have looked like. I couldn't find any from their company specifically, so this is from another company called Dable, but kind of these old school like mechanical slot machines. So at the end of World War II, they sold the company and they established Service Games in 1946, where the service was kind of named for the military focus. And here's the logo from Service Games way back then. So US actually outlawed slot machines in its territories in 1951. So that's not very good for Service Games' business. So they sent 2 employees to Tokyo to try to establish a new distributor directly in Japan. And they actually renamed the company to Service Games of Japan in 1953. And the focus was there's still a big US presence in Japan through the bases. So let's try to provide slot machines to those US bases. So very slot machine focused. And
Which, by the way, I want to mention slot machines is an interesting thing. This would become a problem for arcade manufacturers in Germany, knowing that I live here in Germany now. As it turns out, arcade games are classified under the same sort of label as gambling machines. And so kids didn't have access to arcades and such, which we will be talking about here as we get a bit further.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I wasn't aware of that. That's crazy.
Yeah.
And
Well, I mean, you'll see, locations called arcades that just have slot machines, even in the US, It's
That's true. Absolutely. So you know, there was a lot of other stuff going on with service games. So they actually, it seems like there was some investigations into like tax evasion and other criminal business practices. And what was popular at the time was, and they were banned as a result of those investigations from U.S. air bases in Japan and Philippines. So it was actually somewhat common in the business world back then to basically like dissolve a company and then just establish new companies under different names to effectively continue what they were already doing. So Service Games of Japan was dissolved. But then Bromley, one of the founders, had established two new companies to take over the activities, and these were both registered in Japan. The first one was Nihon Kikai Seizo, which was also known as Sega Inc. And their goal was to manufacture slot machines, and the name Sega came from Service Games. And here's their logo over there, Sega Incorporated. And then the other branch was Nihon Goraku Busan, which was also called Udamatic Inc. And their goal was to distribute and operate coin-op machines, not just slot machines, but generally coin-op machines. And there's their logo over there.
Oh, yeah. Japan amusement products.
Yep. And then they merged in 1964, but then they retained the name Nihon Goraku Busan. So maybe I'll pause if you guys have anything you want to jump in, or no pressure.
I mean, this is still very, very early stuff.
Yeah, very early. So. Not super video game related yet. So it was a bit later that then a company entered the picture called Rosen Enterprises. So David Rosen was an officer in the U.S. Air Force. He was stationed in Tokyo. Here's a photo of him. And he actually launched a photo booth business in Tokyo in '54, and he called it Rosen Enterprises. So eventually, Rosen Enterprises expanded, and they started importing coin-op machines into Japan. And they were acquired by Nihon Goraku Busan in 1965 to form Sega Enterprises Limited. And this is kind of the first dominant Sega logo. It later changed to what we have as the modern like blue logo, but this was their logo from 1965 to 1976. And they wanted to move the focus from slot machines to coin-operated amusement machines, which could have included jukeboxes, could have included pinball games, gun games, a lot of like mechanical coin-operated entertainment games of that era. And they had a lot of secondhand machines. They would import used machines that would break down frequently. So to avoid some of the costs from importing replacement parts, they started building their own in-house replacement parts as well. Awesome. So now is when we actually start getting to the fun stuff regarding video games. So coin-op machines, building their own hardware, they wanted to start getting into the arcade business as well. So in 1970, Sega opened a 125 game arcade in Sapporo, Japan. And then later on, very soon after, they partnered with Toho Films, which you might know from the film Godzilla, where they wanted to make a joint venture into the arcade business. So they built arcades all throughout Japan, which were operational actually until very, very recently. Here's a photo of the Sega Akihabara Building 1, which was opened in 1992. And it's no longer a Sega arcade, but actually and you guys saw this as well, right? You guys traveled.
Yeah. Yep. I mean, it's iconic.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, does not look like that anymore.
Yeah, it's a shame.
Oh, John, you're muted.
Sorry, yes. I actually lived there 20 years ago, and I saw it like this. But since I was back there just like less than a month ago, like it's actually no longer an arcade at all. It's being torn down. It's completely closed now.
That's so depressing.
It was a Gigo arcade for a while, which stands for, unfortunately, Get Into the Gaming Oasis, which is interesting. But they also have evacuated, and the building is now set to be torn down and replaced. So that piece of history is gone, which is a huge shame because, yeah, it was. There's still some awesome retro arcades in that area, but that one is dead.
That's a shame. Yeah, really, really iconic piece of history. And just looking at the street, walking down it with that building, such a shame. So Sega's first entry into actually developing their own video-based games was the game Pong Chong, which they released in 1973. So they were kind of on that hype of Pong being super popular. So this was a Pong-like arcade cabinet.
I think it's worth mentioning though that like at literally during the same time, like one of the games I've actually played there was they also had those electromechanical games, right?
Yeah, a lot of electromechanical games.
And so one of the ones I've played is actually called Sega's Moto Champ, and it actually plays like a proto video game in the sense that you control a handlebars like this, and you literally have like a bike that's like hanging off of a wire that's like suspended over a playfield. And I guess they use maybe magnets or something. I don't know how it actually works, but they move other bikes around this like field while
Wow.
rotating a light, which like projects like lines that makes it look like the road is moving, but it's literally just like rotating a physical object with like a light shining through it to create the shadows which represent the lines. And you're basically racing through this while avoiding other bikes, physically moving a bike around the screen. And that was the same year as Pongtron here. So like they were still deep into electromechanical games at the time, or Elemecha, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of companies at that time, like microprocessors were still super new. So like these types of
Yeah.
electronic games were like still pretty brand new. Oh, that's great.
Exactly. So it's super cool what they were doing back then with like just physical objects.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So wanting to further expand into the arcade business, Sega took control of a business called Kingdom of Oz. It was a series of arcades that were in California malls. In the range of 1975 to 1976, that's when Sega took over. So here's a photo of Kingdom of Oz from Puente Hills Mall in the city of Industry, California. But later they kind of became rebranded as Sega Centers. So they were all converted into Sega Centers, then they were opened even more so in June 1977. So here's kind of an example of a Sega Center in Sherman Oaks Galleria in LA, California. I don't know if you guys saw any of these. I didn't see them growing up in San Diego, but I don't know if they were anywhere else in the country or if they were just California or something.
Certainly nothing like
Mm,
that around where I was growing up.
Mm-hmm.
we did end up having some pretty gigantic arcades where I grew up, but nothing specifically Sega Center branded.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, it seems like it was fairly California centric still.
Yeah.
So then there was a series of companies that Sega was acquiring. They wanted to expand into the microprocessor-based arcade games, given their popularity. So I'm just going to kind of rapid fire a couple games that they built through those acquisitions. One of the popular ones was a game called Head On. This was actually one of the first ones to have this like moving around a screen, eating dots gameplay feature that you all probably recognize from Pac-Man. Um, there's also Frogger, which I played it a lot as a kid. It's been released on every platform of any type over the years. And then the last one, this one's a really cool one. Zaxxon is one of the first side-scrolling
Yes.
games ever made. Yeah, did you guys want to? Yeah, feel free to jump in.
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily describe this as side scrolling per se. It's more like isometric scrolling,
Right.
right?
Yeah, true.
But isometric stuff would become pretty big after a
Yeah.
while. But yeah, this was a pretty big step up visually from a lot of the stuff happening at the time, just in terms
And
of
it's
representing detail on screen, right?
especially since you can adjust your height, which,
Exactly.
makes it a lot more interesting compared to other games of that type.
Right. Like you see the walls there and objects in the playfield, you actually have to uh you know overcome it. And this is the thing though, when you compare to other 1981 games, like that's the year of stuff like Galaga, Donkey
Hmm.
Kong, Tempest, Defender. If you go look at them, they're all much more simplistic with like stark black backgrounds and sort of like simple objects moving around. So to have like a playfield this detailed scrolling
Mhm.
smoothly across the screen, it was impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of I mean, a lot of the games that use this isometric style, it's like one of the first entry points into, you're not quite doing 3D graphics yet, but you're like
Right.
simulating a 3D-like experience in 2D, which was pretty cool for the time.
You're thinking in 3D, I suppose.
Exactly.
Right. Which is very important about when we talk about Sega.
Yeah.
So how did they actually enter the home console market? Well, the arcade industry was experiencing a little bit of a downturn in the early 1980s. So Sega Enterprises Limited, so the Japan distribution, and there's a lot of different companies called Sega that are all part of the same umbrella. So the Sega Enterprise Limited Japan president Hayao Nakayama wanted to transition into home consoles. Here's a photo of him taken in 2008. So first, Sega released the Sega Computer 3000. We mentioned in the previous lectures, home personal computers were starting to become big in the early 80s as like microprocessors became cheaper. So here's a photo of the Sega Computer 3000, the SC 3000. I don't know if either of you two ever used one of these, or I
I
never.
have not.
Yeah.
I've had very limited experience with one, but it's not. I don't own one.
Yeah, yeah. And it wasn't one of their more popular things. It was kind of their
No,
first
no, no.
entry point. So around this time, they learned that Nintendo was starting to make games only home console. That was the Famicom that we've talked about, that everyone is very familiar with. So they wanted to compete in the home console market as well, and they released the Sega game, or the SG-1000 home console, in 1983. And here's a photo of how it looked like. I think here's where you would put the cartridges. It had an attached controller, so it wasn't like removable or anything, directly attached. And it exceeded expectations. It did sell more than they were planning, but it was still massively dominated by the Famicom in Japan. They did then release a revised version of it called the SG-1002 in 1984, which looked like this, a little bit sleeker design. I'm not sure what the other differences were here. I know that it also had removable controllers now instead of having it hardwired into the console. And then later they released the Mark III, which is yet another revision of the SG-1000 in 1985, which here's a photo of the Sega Mark III. So this is going to be the entry point into Sega kind of expanding into the rest of the world. So Sega wanted to expand its global position. They established Sega Europe in 1984 in London. They established Sega Enterprises USA in San Jose in 1985. And the Sega Enterprises USA was focused on re-entering the North American arcade market. And even though it was a newer establishment, it actually quickly outgrew Sega Europe. There was like a little bit of rivalry between the two kind of subdivisions of Sega. And eventually they actually had a separate Sega of America, which was established in San Francisco in 1986. And Sega of America was more so focused on consumer products. So Sega Enterprises was more so the arcade market, versus Sega of America is more home consumer products. And this is going to kind of set the stage for the console war. So maybe I'll pause here if anyone in the room has any questions or comments, or all good. Okay, so now for the fun stuff. So Genesis does what Nintendo don't. So first things first, there's a little bit of context that we need to play about Nintendo's actions in the American market. So we talked about Nintendo, to try to like recover from American markets kind of skepticism over the video game industry. They wanted to maintain quality control. So part of that was Nintendo required all developers to order cartridges exclusively from them. So that gave Nintendo full control over all manufacturing, all distribution, and their the rationale was they wanted to maintain quality, they wanted to prevent market saturation, but as a result, they restricted every single game publisher to just 5 games every year, which clearly angers some folks if they want to maybe produce more games. It's a heavy restriction that a lot of folks weren't happy with. So you might see this official Nintendo seal of quality on various old Nintendo products. Do they still put these on modern products? I haven't purchased a Nintendo product in a minute, but
no, not that I know of.
Not like
okay.
that. Well, actually, there might. I swear, I just saw one today on a Switch 2 related product.
Yeah,
One
right.
of the
Like I feel
cases.
like my answer's no, but
They-
I
Yeah.
feel like I've
Yeah,
seen it
they
somewhere.
might still be using this, but I haven't really paid attention to that in a while. That's a good point.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, a lot of developers got around the 5 games a year limit by, you know, having sub companies, you know,
Exactly. Yep.
to release more games. Like Konami had Ultra games.
Oh yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Just to iterate on this point, I think they still do have this, but it's just on accessories and the color has shifted. So
I see.
it's, I think, cyan, I'm not sure.
Okay, so I don't know if you guys were able to hear that. So someone said it seems like they are still using the seal of quality, but it seems to be mainly on accessories, and it seems
that explains it.
color.
Yeah, that would make
Yeah,
sense.
yeah. And the European one, by the way, is circular, so
Oh.
which is interesting. Versus the oval of the US, which is how I used to tell between PAL and NTSC cards.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't
Or like
realize
NES
that.
games and such. It's
Oh,
funny.
I
One
mean,
thing
that's
to
certainly
note
not.
though about all of this though that I think is very important is that when dealing with the Famicom/NES, you know, the family computer, the Japanese version, Nintendo did not manufacture and control third-party publishers the way they did in North America and Europe, right?
Mhm.
So Famicom games could ship on. Every publisher had their own style of cartridge and board designs. They were able to include special chips in the cartridges they created themselves. Yeah, Coury's holding one up, which
Oh, here, let
allowed
me,
them sometimes to include functionalities and features that were not possible in American cartridges, right? And so Nintendo of America especially, and I guess of Europe, was much more controlling than the Nintendo of Japan in that sense. And it actually hurt some of the games that we received or prevented them from shipping here at all.
oh, that's wild. Coury, sorry, I
Mhm.
had the camera only showing one
Oh, it's okay.
person. Could you shut it? Or
Oh yeah, yeah.
yeah, here, I can make you the spotlight.
The camera doesn't have doesn't have autofocus, so you'll see, some of them are just different colors, different shapes. You can see that on the top of them. It's just slightly
Even the
different.
boxes they shipped into stores could be variable sizing.
Right.
Okay, there we go.
But yeah, you can definitely tell a big difference between them, and I think it's pretty interesting. It's nice to see these different colors, and makes for a very interesting looking library.
Oh, that's super cool.
They stopped that going forward though after the Famicom. Alas.
As it goes. And then the last thing is they also required third-party developers to develop exclusively with Nintendo, which that really hurts competition because then you have a lot of big, video game companies want to be able to sell for multiple different platforms. Not very good. And then this is a little bit in the future, so I'm going to start talking about some stuff that comes up with the Super Nintendo, but it is going to set the stage for some of the issues that were going on during the console wars. But another thing that was challenging was Nintendo was having a lot of conflict with retail companies in the US because they wanted to be a lot stricter on the return policies than retail companies were kind of comfortable with at the time. So they saw that there was kind of an uptick where customers would return their NES consoles claiming that it was defective and then use the refund that they would get from the retailer to purchase a Super Nintendo. So here's a photo of the NES that folks are probably familiar with. Here's a photo of the Super Nintendo that's going to come up in a little bit. And the retailers wouldn't typically require proof at this time. It's not like modern days where you have to have like a receipt and like there's a 90-day warranty and stuff like that. Back then, you could kind of just walk in with the console and say that it's defective. And usually the retailer would take the console back, give you a refund, and then they would then send it back to the manufacturer and get their own refund. So kind of the manufacturer would eat the cost, which understandably Nintendo wasn't a fan of. So Nintendo wanted to impose a time limit of 90 days to return a console, which the retailers felt that's a little bit too imposing on us. We just want to sell your consoles. We don't want to be told how to sell them. So that kind of sets the stage for Sega's entrance. So Sega enters the American market. The SG-1000 console, as I said earlier, did better in Japan than they were expecting, but it still didn't do great. So Sega wanted to do better in the American market against Nintendo, so they wanted to kind of repackage the console to target it towards the Western audience. So they rebranded the Mark III as the Master System, and they released it in the US in September 1986. They chose Master because, like, in a competition, usually there's just like one Master. And then they wanted to go with this like futuristic, sleek black design that was kind of popular in the West at the time. So here's a photo of the Sega Master System with a controller. And I don't know if you guys have any of these or
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
It's a lot bigger than it looks too. It's slightly too
it's not a
wide.
small machine. And there would be other variants of this, by the way, though I'm
Right.
not sure that they released them in the US, but
Just the Master System 2, which came out, after the Genesis,
okay,
or
okay.
late in the. It might be right before the Genesis came out, but it's much smaller. It has a little flip open top for the cartridge.
Very rounded design.
Yeah.
Oh, it's nifty. So they were hoping to sell like 400 to 750,000 consoles by the end of 1986. They ended up actually selling 125,000, so like not amazing. They did better than the Atari 7800. Atari was kind of struggling in the home console market here, but they did significantly lower than the NES, like an order of magnitude lower. So they still didn't quite have a lot of kind of strength in the American market yet.
And I think later on, the system was distributed not by Sega itself anymore, but they offloaded it to, I think it was Tonka.
Oh,
Yes.
I
Which was
didn't
another
realize
toy
that.
company, right? And of course, in Europe, there was a variety of other distributors as well for the system, not Sega itself. And then in Brazil, which is a whole different can of worms,
It's
there was
insane.
Oh,
Tectoy,
yeah.
and that goes places.
It goes places, and it's still being made today and being sold today.
Oh, is it really? I had no
Yeah.
idea.
I mean, and not just that.
Hugely
I mean,
popular in Brazil.
the Mega Drive size Genesis is also a thing over there. Like there's HDMI, output system sold there, and it's wild.
Yeah.
Whoa, I had no idea. Like just
Oh yeah, it's
like not mods or anything.
nope,
No,
nope.
Wow.
It's all being made by Tectoy, and they're producing games. I mean, I don't know if there's still new games being made. I know that there is by the like the fan community, but I'm not
Yeah.
sure if those are getting released on cartridge there or not.
I mean they hardware wise they are quite different, to be fair, compared to what the
Mhm.
original was. But it's a very different design, and yeah, they kind of kept it going.
Oh,
They've
that's
always
super.
they've been selling Sega down there for a long time. It's not like you can't get new machines, but you can. But it's just this stuff is very popular, and it's actually
Mhm.
very important for what would become a lot of future indie projects and indie games,
Mhm.
because people in Brazil were inspired very heavily by Sega in a way that the West was maybe less so, and that is reflected in games being made today, which is awesome. So
Oh, that's super cool.
Brazilian indie games are definitely something to watch out for.
So yeah, so later on so Sega released the Mega Drive in Japan in October 29th, 1988. Here's what the original Mega Drive looked like. Here's it is with a controller. And the Mega Drive name was actually what was used in the global releases, if I'm not mistaken, as well. For the US market, though, they wanted to call it the Genesis. It was a rebrand, and they were trying to target the American
Well,
consumer.
I believe what it was there was another company that had dibs on that name, Mega Drive, or was using it for something else, and they essentially
Oh.
were forced to choose a
Mhm.
different name. You know how America is with legal things, right? So
Yeah.
that I think that forced their hand, and as a result, when they had to decide a new name, they came up with something called Genesis. But of course, the screenshot here is actually of the second model.
Yep.
The original one looked just like the Mega Drive before, but with different colors.
Yeah.
Which
What like
I
a white
think,
reset button instead of blue.
and it was cool because that the big 16-bit like text on there and high
Mhm.
definition graphics. I mean, it seemed really powerful at the time.
Yeah.
just
It's my favorite
just
looking
for its
console of
design.
all time.
It was so cool.
Oh man, I gotta update these slides. My bad.
It's all right.
Yeah.
It's all good.
But yeah, this is the Genesis 2. That's the cheaper model they followed.
Hmm.
The re-release. Yeah, and quite a few consoles in this time period had stuff like that. I mean, there was like the SNES Mini and a lot of like
Mhm.
I mean,
re-releases that came out later on.
I would say we still have that today, right? Like it's pretty
Yeah.
common to have redesigns and re-releases.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah,
makes sense.
absolutely. Michael Katz, who was previously really, really high up at Atari, he became the CEO of Sega of America in 1989. Here's a photo of Michael Katz. And he was hired specifically to try to implement a marketing strategy to really push the Genesis in the US. And their target was 1 million console sales. So his ultimate strategy was there was two main prongs to it. First, he wanted to really stress the arcade-like graphics. So some of the even early games on the Genesis had really good graphics compared to like the simpler graphics of NES that looked a little bit more similar to what you might see in an arcade. It's like a lot of colors on screen, a lot of things moving at the same time.
Yeah. This looks like it might be a mobile port of it.
Yeah,
Though.
I couldn't find a good GIF of. I gotta yeah revamp these and maybe like record a couple clips myself. But you're right. You're right.
Still, the main, I mean, obviously this was like the first big transition to like new, more powerful hardware, I think.
Mhm.
And we'd just seen variations, but they didn't feel that different. Where the Mega Drive Genesis used the same CPU that Sega had in their arcade systems, which was the
Mhm.
Motorola X68000 16-bit CPU. It was also used in like the Macintosh computers at the time, the Amiga, lots of devices. It was a really powerful chip, and they had their own video display processor and all that. So it could throw around more like sprites, individual objects on the screen. It could do more overall colors. You could do parallax scrolling. The idea where like you have like different layers that move at different rates across the screen to give depth to the background, and more stuff like that. In addition to the extra sound, and it just made it a much more potent machine, which is
Mhm.
why they were able to bring arcade style games home, but not all of them, as we'll see.
Mm-hmm.
And just really, really powerful, especially, for the time, and continues to be,
Yeah.
people like homebrew developers and former developers are still working magic with it.
There's still new games being made for this, like release that you can go buy right now, which is cool.
Yeah, it's crazy. And absolutely. So the advertising as well really wanted to emphasize those features that like John and Coury were emphasizing, that like, hey, this does a lot of crazy stuff. And we saw some somewhat bizarre advertisements at the time.
Genesis does.
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does.
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis does.
Get Joe Montana free, Pat Riley free, Buster Douglas free, Super Monaco GP free, or Collins free. What Nintendon't? Buy a 16-bit Genesis system between now and October 31st and get an extra game.
So yeah, they really pushed this like Genesis does what Nintendon't campaign. And then you also saw it in that commercial, but one of the other prongs was they really wanted to get naming rights from celebrities. So like Joe Montana football, Joe Montana was a big quarterback at the time. So like, let's actually have on the cover art like some famous celebrity that the consumers might recognize and want to purchase this game because of that brand recognition. And then they cranked it up significantly. So Genesis was still struggling versus Nintendo. So Nintendo didn't really seem phased by Genesis's kind of challenges. So Sega wanted their own iconic mascot to kind of compete with Mario. And there was actually a few different mascots that were tried out. I didn't include all of them here. And I want to highlight, so Nintendo had a lot of marketing at the time. So here's the movie The Wizard, which was for the most part basically like a 1.5 hour advertisement for the upcoming Super Mario 3 game. So Sega wanted their own mascot that they could like heavily advertise. So kids,
It's so interesting, by the way, how all the marketing around this was so much more focused on like different audiences, right? And this like attitude stuff, whereas in other countries it was very different. Like I don't know if you guys have seen the original Mega Drive commercials from Japan in 1988, but they had a guy named Seiko Ito who had this like crazy bowl cut thing going on. He was like a comedian, author, like a rapper, and all this kind of stuff popular at the time. And it's a much more spacey, like surrealistic ad that like pushes the slogan visual shock, speed shock, sound shock, which is something you'd see again in a game later on. And then also in Europe, there was some very unusual advertisements as well, where like I think it was like, what was it? It's like to be this good takes ages.
Yeah.
And then they sort of flip around ages to become Sega.
Oh, that's cool.
And so like, and every country had its own sort of advertising feel, but in America it was definitely this mix of like sports and celebrities and like targeting like that perceived American demographic, if you will. So like a lot of the style and stuff that you might see in other regions was kind of sucked out in favor of this very bold commercialistic kind of approach. And yeah, but it was important. It did its job.
Yeah. Although it doesn't age very well.
It maybe hasn't aged as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, kind of to kind of piggyback off of what you guys were saying, yeah, like a lot of the kids that grew up with the NES were now becoming teenagers. So that's really a big market that Sega was trying to target. They wanted to make Nintendo look childish, make Sega look cool, edgy, bold. And Sega CEO, so Sega actually hired Tom Kalinske to be their new CEO after Cats. And he like really cranked up that Genesis is cool marketing campaign even harder. Here's a photo of Tom Kalinske. And here's actually a quote from a Sega 16 interview of how he was recruited. And it's like a bizarre story where I guess he was just on vacation with his family in Hawaii. And like Hayao Nakayama, like the lead of Sega in Japan, just like shows up on the beach while he's like lounging there and just recruits him to join Sega at that point. So he says like, hey, come back to Japan. We have this new technology we want to show you. I think Kalinske actually asks his daughter like, hey, what should I do? Thinking that she's going to say like, no, don't go, like we're on vacation. And then the daughter says like, yeah, you should go. So he flies out to Japan, sees Sega's new hardware, and kind of history is made, which is pretty random. And yeah, so what John was alluding to, the marketing campaigns, here's one example commercial.
Young Bobby Engels has a problem. He needs to earn the respect of his peers. So he gets Sega Genesis, the ultimate action system. And then he buys Mortal Kombat, the arcade edition, and the all-new Shinobi 3, and Marvel's X-Men. Now, things are pretty much okay.
I said chocolate chip. Say it. Say it.
Wow.
Yeah, right. I almost
So,
feel like they weren't showing like a real version of Mortal Kombat there, or they were showing the arcade version of
I
Mortal
know.
Kombat in those
So
screenshots.
I'm sure we'll get into this, but the Mortal Kombat stuff was kind of crazy at the time because like the Sega version was the one that you could indeed enjoy with all the blood and gore and all that, which is like talk of the town, if you will. Where the original, well, this is getting ahead, but that was part of the console war stuff. Was Nintendo was trying to be more puerile, if you will, at the time, and kid friendly, and Sega was willing to push the envelope.
Go
And
for it,
they
actually. So actually, I don't have slides on that. So I was gonna hope that you guys could talk about that
Mhm.
actually. The whole like
okay.
blood and gore and
So we're already this jumps ahead a little bit, but this is already into the early 90s here, like 93, 92
Yeah.
even, I guess, where games like were starting to do more like violent realistic depictions within them. Like Mortal Kombat of course had blood. You had Lethal Enforcers was part of this, which was like a shooting game set in like realistic scenarios where it's a light gun, so you're actually pointing a physical gun at the screen, shooting bad guys, which was
Characters that are digitized actors.
digitized from real people.
Yeah.
You had the rise of full motion video games on CD based platforms, which we'll talk about. Basically, all these sort of more realistic depictions, which essentially earned the ire of things in the US, well, like the US government in North America, where they started to be like, hey, wait a minute, like we need to do something about this.
What about the
this whole,
kids?
about the kids, like the kids can't be playing this stuff. And famously, you had like Nintendo and Sega in court sort of battling each other out. And it's a long story, but it ultimately is what led to the rating system that we see today.
Mhm.
Where you have like E for everyone and all that, T for teen. Every country has their own rating system now,
yeah.
but the American one was born out of this specific sort of incident where they were essentially told like, you either police yourselves properly, come up with a standard, or the government's going to step in.
Yeah.
And it's really wild to think about because the quote unquote violence is rather quaint by today's standards, I would say.
Yes.
Oh, absolutely.
But it was definitely a thing, and it was very, very much an American thing specifically, I would say.
Absolutely. See, let me here. There we go. So I mentioned earlier they wanted a mascot to compete with Mario. So Naoto Oshima came up with Sonic the Hedgehog, which was so here's a photo of Naoto Oshima. And the idea was let's have a human-like character with like attitude. They were fully going in on this whole attitude thing to go and appeal to teenagers. And they made him blue to kind of represent Sega's logo at the time, or still their logo. So here's some concept art for Sonic the Hedgehog. And they really wanted to emphasize like fast running speed. They wanted to showcase the processing speed of the Genesis. So Sonic was fast. The gameplay was fast.
That just we got some slide work to do here, but that would be actually Sonic and
Later
Knuckles.
on. Yep.
So
Yeah. Sorry.
That is the fourth release, but you get the idea. I mean, I think people still know who Sonic is today.
Yeah.
So now Sega really wanted to kind of butt heads with Nintendo on the Genesis. So Nintendo released the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, the SNES, in 1991. So Sega Genesis already had a head start, and they had a pretty aggressive ad campaign. And also, Sega Genesis had a large library of games in the US at the time. So by the time the Super Nintendo launched with only 8 games, the Sega Genesis had over 150 games.
Mm-hmm.
And Nintendo's library, a lot of it was held up by, you have the Mario and Zelda games that are these like recognizable franchises, but they usually only came out once a year versus Sega was just churning them out onto the Genesis really rapidly. So a lot more games. So eventually, after years of kind of taking a passive stance towards Sega, Nintendo finally decided to fight back. And they had their own similar marketing campaign where they wanted to emphasize advanced Super Nintendo features that weren't available on the Genesis. So, for example, there's this like Mode 7 graphics mode that the Super Nintendo had, that you could like rotate graphics on the screen to kind of simulate 3D perspective events. And this was used in games like Super Mario Kart for the Super Nintendo, where you can kind of have a 3D looking world by just rotating this this graphic on the ground.
So just to explain a little more about how that works, it's just so back in the day, what made game consoles so fast at doing what they do is that they relied on specific hardware that it would accelerate operations, right? Like games would be built from what's called tile maps, where imagine just like a tile floor where each tile could be its own unique piece of art, and you essentially build the graphics from a bunch of these like squares, right? But you can only have X amount of squares on screen at a time due to memory and storage constraints. And then the characters would be made up of sprites, which were things where the hardware was designed to move them around quickly, right? All Mode 7 did was it allowed you to take a tile map, and instead of only scrolling it left and right, you could actually like rotate it on a Z axis and sort of give this fake perspective. And they called it Mode 7 because the system had other modes as well, right? So different display modes that you could put the system into. So if you wanted to display like things in high resolution, there was a mode for that. If you wanted to display a certain type of color combination, background combination, there were modes for that, and Mode 7 was this. But it came with some pretty severe limitations as well in terms of what you could do. And in fact, this game here, Super Mario Kart, to pull off the split screen feature that they're showing, they actually needed additional hardware in the cartridge, which was the DSP-1 chip. So that was
Yep.
one of the cool things about old game consoles, is you could actually put extra chips on directly into the game cartridges. If you want, like, you can't imagine that today, right? It's like, oh, you got the PS5 Pro now versus the PS5. But back then they're like, well, we want to do this cool thing. We're just going to put an extra chip in the cartridge. And, it might cost more, but you could do some pretty crazy stuff. But it also made games more expensive, and that's one of the weird things. The Genesis / Mega Drive largely didn't do that. It could. There were like at least one game that used a special chip in the cartridge, but it wasn't necessary. The system could do everything it did without it. Where the Super NES was built with that functionality sort of in mind to overcome some of its own limitations, and so a lot of games had had extra chips in there.
Yeah, and it was done a little bit on the NES, quite a bit, or it was done on NES as well.
Agreed. So, but I real quick to put some interesting context as well, in terms of the market as a whole, right? Because we're talking about this Super Nintendo versus Sega Genesis thing, and that was what was fought in America. But over in Japan, still, where a lot of the games were majorly being created, of course, there was a different battle happening with. Are you guys familiar with the company NEC? Maybe, maybe not, but they were a huge electronics conglomerate in Japan, very big company. They partnered with Hudson Soft to create their own game console in 1987 called PC Engine, which came out in the US as TurboGrafx 16 and was a gigantic failure here. But the PC Engine was gigantic in Japan. It did very, very well. It did much better than the Sega Mega Drive did, and it had way more games for it. And that actually sort of changed a lot of things about the industry. In fact, I think the PC Engine got its CD-ROM add-on. It was like the first device ever that could play games on a CD-ROM. And so like NEC sort of pioneered the CD format for use in games, and it was like a really, really big deal. And that's important to keep in mind as to what would sort of change the approach these companies were taking. And Sega didn't fail in Japan. The Mega Drive wasn't a big success, but Sega found their own success still in arcades, game centers, and whatnot, which would lead on to their post Genesis time period.
Right. Absolutely.
So yeah.
Awesome. And then there was also like a lot of marketing that Nintendo was doing. Nintendo Power. They had magazines that they were really showcasing some of those Nintendo features, the Nintendo games. So I'm gonna go a little quicker just to. Oh, actually,
yeah.
No, we're good. So eventually Sony also enters the console war. So John like segued this very nicely. He mentioned CD-ROM technology. So in the late 80s, video games, so prior to the late 80s, video game consoles mainly used cartridges to store games. And to give you some context, the largest Super Nintendo cartridge had a capacity of like roughly 6 megabytes. So we saw 2 games in technically this is the Super Famicom. These are 2 Super Famicom games, but Star Ocean and Tales of Fantasia, which were released in Japan. These games had the maximum capacity cartridges that we saw. But then the CD-ROM was released commercially in 1985. So here's a photo of a CD-ROM, or I guess it's a scanned image of a CD-ROM, but either way, here's a CD-ROM, and it was co-developed by Sony and Philips. And the important thing here was the storage capacity was insanely larger. So now on this little disc, you can have like 700 megabytes, so more than 100 times the capacity of what was the largest Super Nintendo or Super Famicom cartridge at the time. And then, you know, as John alluded to, a lot of different cartridge-based consoles started releasing CD-ROM add-ons to take advantage of this. You could have like more cinematic films. You can actually have like full motion video on the game itself. Oh yeah, go for it.
And that's a fun distinction, actually. You can go ahead on the next slide there. Keep going. Because, you know, this was the add-on for that. There was the PC Engine, which I mentioned. And then Sega, of course, did their own CD attachment. But when people look back at this, they often associate it with full motion video, right? But that was also very specifically an American thing. The Japanese use of CD-ROM for games, there's almost no video at all. Both the PC Engine and Mega CD, like all the Japanese games, like you barely ever see FMV. They took a completely different approach that I think holds up a lot better to this day. And I actually think FMV, full motion video, harmed these systems tremendously in the West because they're not fun. People thought video looked cool, but it wasn't good because you're just watching video.
Right,
watching a novel at best. Whereas in Japan, it was more like you could do more expansive, like, you know, pixel art based cutscenes, voice acting, music, like cool visual effects, just a lot of stuff to sort of enhance the game experience. And we saw so much of this on the PC Engine, really pushing the limits of what was possible then. Whereas the Western developers were they basically had 2 types of games, unfortunately. It was full motion video games, or like, let's take our cartridge game and put music tracks on it.
Yeah.
That was about it. So I think the US take on Sega CD and all the marketing around it and the push for it was a huge misfire from the American side.
Just trying to make it seem more real, I guess. You know, US companies were obsessed with making games realistic.
Yeah,
exactly. It was not a good idea.
But the PC Engine CD-ROM add-on didn't really, it mainly only used it for storage, right? Like it didn't really have any additional.
Not true.
Okay, so there's additional hardware.
Do you remember this? So if you had NEC was crazy in Japan. They released so many different pieces of hardware. And this shows like you could buy an add-on for it, but they also released entire units that were all in one. But you had to use these special memory cards inserted into the core graphics slot there to use CD-ROMs. And those system cards had extra memory. And so you would see games that were like CD-ROM, CD-ROM, you know, the CD-ROM squared. It was just called ROM. But then they had super CD-ROMs and arcade CD-ROMs. And those relied on the extra memory that you would get with the cue card inserted into the slot. So PC Engine CD games actually had way more functionality than normal PC Engine
because you could keep on expanding it.
So that made them pretty advanced.
So I think the next class is going to come. So I'm going to try to click through these real quick.
Okay.
But so basically the main thing. So Nintendo wanted to jump in as well. So some historical context: Nintendo wanted one for the Super Nintendo. Sony engineer Ken Kutaragi saw his daughter playing Famicom games, got him interested. He developed an audio chip for the Super Nintendo. Sony as a company wasn't super interested, but one of the high up Sony execs, Norio Oga, let him proceed with the project. He's actually credited with developing the compact disc. He's a photo of him in 1991. So Kutaragi proposed a Sony Nintendo collaboration, which was the CD-ROM drive for the Super Nintendo. And they actually started developing a Sony branded PlayStation starting in late 1988. And the goal was they designed it to support both Super Nintendo cartridges and these new Super Disc CD-based games. Here's a very early prototype of what the console would have looked like.
And for a long time, it was thought to be completely lost till someone randomly found one.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
and
Yeah.
also Kutaragi-san himself has a unit as well.
Oh, does he? Oh, that's cool.
He does, and it's not yellowed in the front like that. It actually
Yeah.
looks much better. And also, it's important to note that they worked heavily with Toshiba for like the actual like hardware side of things. So Sony and Toshiba worked together. One of the key engineers, Ohashi-san, actually was diagnosed with cancer on the day or around the time that the original PlayStation launched and passed away, unfortunately, before he could see it find success. But his wife still has an original PlayStation 1 from launch day that she keeps,
Wow.
which is interesting.
That's wild. Yeah. So in 1991, Sony and Nintendo both presented at the Consumer Electronics Show, and this was kind of a big pivotal point in the console wars. So here's a photo from that Consumer Electronics Show. So Sony publicly showcased the Super Nintendo compatible PlayStation console. Here's a more mature prototype of what that would have looked like. But then the very next day, Nintendo revealed that instead of partnering with Sony, they were going to go partner with Philips instead for the CD add-on. Sony and Nintendo were still negotiating to try to see what was possible, and they did actually reach a deal in 1992, where Sony would produce Super Nintendo compatible hardware, whereas Nintendo would retain control over the control and profit over the games. But the relationship was strained from that big deal at the Consumer Electronics Show. So some of the Sony executives still thought that partnering with Nintendo was a safer path because Nintendo was more experienced in the game industry. But Kutaragi wanted to abandon the Super Nintendo and wanted Sony to make their own standalone next-gen CD console, which kind of led to a generation of CD-based consoles that were coming out. So Sega released a CD-based Saturn console in '94. And there's also the Saturn North American model in 1995. Sony released the CD-based PlayStation in Japan in 1994. So this is what a lot of folks probably saw as one of their first entry points into CD-based gaming. And then Nintendo, though, in this generation decided, I guess generations aren't very good to describe video game consoles, but in general, in the mid-90s, their new console, to compete with these other two, they stuck with cartridges. So you might have seen the Nintendo 64, very popular console, but and the pros were on Nintendo's side, they thought cartridges, they would have faster loading time. So the spinning disc takes a little bit of time to like move to the sector and actually read out the data, versus this console's cartridge is actually like wired into the console. So it's much faster to load data. They're more durable. Discs can scratch, they can break, versus these cartridges are pretty durable. Harder to pirate. You can't just buy a cartridge burner very easily, but you could relatively easily buy a DVD burner. And it wasn't super hard to circumvent the anti-piracy features in some of these early CD-based consoles.
One nice note real quick about all this and CD-ROM stuff is that these were successful consoles somewhat.
Yeah.
But there were so many at this time. It's just unbelievable. I mean, you had like Philips with their own CDI stuff. You had, like Casio, Loopy. You had the FM Town stuff in Japan. You had 3DO, Atari Jaguar. Sega was doing all these different add-ons. You had the Virtual Boy, Jaguar CD, the Neo Geo, the Apple Bondi Pippin, Atmark, all of this stuff, and so much more. There was just an incredible amount of game systems being released during this time, and nearly all of them failed miserably.
Yep.
And these three were the only ones really left standing, and the PlayStation was the one that came out on top in the end.
Yep, absolutely. And just real quick, I already kind of mentioned this, smaller storage capacity was the main downside. It was also more expensive to manufacture games on cartridge. A CD, you can just kind of like churn out really cheaply. They were very cheap to produce. Cartridges were a bit more expensive to produce. So the 64 did actually like release the 64 disk drive CD add-on in Japan. Didn't do very well. Oh, I didn't put a photo of it. Shoot. But yeah, as John mentioned, the PlayStation extremely dominated this generation of consoles. Nintendo 64 still did pretty well. Sega Saturn didn't do as strongly. But this was
only in the US. Saturn beat out the N64 in Japan.
Oh, did it? I had no idea.
Yeah, it was far more successful in Japan. That's why the Saturn is such a great machine, because it was actually a pretty big success in Japan, and the library's
more
massive.
Successful than the Mega Drive, I think.
Yeah, much more successful than the Mega Drive. So it's kind of an unsung, amazing platform that's worth checking out.